I listened to an interview with Representative Maxwell Frost of Florida the other day. If you haven't listened to him, I highly recommend you get on YouTube or read some articles about him. He is the first Gen X member of Congress. And I beg your pardon? Oh, Gen Z, thank you. Gen Z member of Congress. And honestly, I think if you just need like a shot in the arm, check him out. There were a few things that really struck me about what he talked about in the interview. The first is that he's just so clear about what pivotal moments in history impacted his generation versus the generations of those of us sitting in this room. And that's where he draws his perspective and his kind of his clarity, I would say. The other folks in the Senate, in the Congress, are average twice his age. So that's kind of how extreme this is at this moment. I think it's a little window into what is coming. He is a deeply, deeply value-based person, and he uses his values as an image for America and as his North Star. In an interview with ABC, he said, "I think we're in this politics now where people are scared to talk about their North Star. And I think it's important that we don't lose sight of that. Healthcare for everybody, ending gun violence, combating the climate crisis, these things are really important. And even though we're not going to get it next year, you can't take a first step in a journey if you don't know where you're going." He continued, "I think it's important for us to realize that it's okay to ask for a lot. In fact, that's what people sent us here for." Frost added, "It doesn't mean that we're not going to compromise for something else, but it means we shouldn't show up at the debate already at the compromise." So this month, we are exploring finding our center. And as I mentioned earlier, today we're talking about finding our center in social justice. What is our North Star? We come from the belief that we value deeds and not creeds, that all of us need to be engaged in some form of action to support a more just and loving world. Belief and action go hand in hand. We come from a legacy of ministers and congregants who have made a real difference in our country. Our ancestors worked bravely and passionately on abolition, women's suffrage, prison reform, education, all sorts of things. Across the country, you will find Unitarian and Universalist on the front line in supporting movements in a quieter way. We understand that immigration justice, queer rights, racial justice, women's rights, reproductive rights, climate justice, and economic inequality, they're all interconnected. And we strive to side with love as a response to the wave of division and anger and hate that has been forever present in our country, sometimes more hidden than now, but it has been forever present in our country. Our Unitarian Universalist ancestors' center was a biblically based Christian faith, fueled by a progressive reading and application of the Bible. This continues for some Unitarian and Universalist and congregations. Others, like ours, tend to lean on our own personal theologies and values, informed and connected to the principles of the Unitarian Universalist Association, which we covenant to affirm. Many of you may be aware that we are currently rewriting our values and our principles. Kathy Burek over there on the computer is on the group, or a liaison to the group who is working on that. Who knows where we will go this year, but we have started. Our principles aren't carved in stone. We are an evolving faith. I talked about that a couple months ago. And we are constantly trying to be reminded of what matters and what's calling us to be our best selves and to create a better world. So here are a few principles, Diana mentioned one of them, that are at the center of our social justice commitment and work. We believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Most people remember something close to that. We want a world where there is justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. We affirm the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and we honor and respect the interdependent web of all existence, of which we all in this room are a part of. Sometimes you just don't exactly know where you are. So justice, you may have noticed, justice is used in 2 of those principles, and that means that, and also 4 out of 7 kind of lean into this part of our lives, part of our faith. At the core of who we are is the knowledge that an unjust world disregards our connectedness and needs repair, and we should not stand by idly when our neighbors, communities, country, and world need us to be engaged in some way. There are so many ways for us to be involved publicly and privately, in masses, and on your own, sitting at your own desk or on your own phone. There's so many ways we can impact the world. Unitarian Universalist Theodore Parker, who was a preacher and lecturer and public intellectual in Boston in the 1800s, was a leader in the movement to combat the stricter Fugitive Slave Act. If you remember the Fugitive Slave Act, that was giving people permission to turn in slaves both in the North and the South and return them back to their, whatever you want to call it, people who thought they owned them. Parker called the law a hateful statute of kidnappers, and he helped form the Boston Vigilant Committee, which openly resisted the law. He is the originator of the quote, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye only reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience, and from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice." I love that, how we can divine it by conscience. He spoke that sermon in 1853. This week I discovered the term arc bender. I really like that, to be an arc bender. And I know that there's been many stages in my life when I think I maybe warranted that description, and other times when I sure fell short. Perhaps it's the same for you. I know that so many of you have volunteered in agencies and organizations that work for a more just world. And I also know that we as a congregation, both of individuals and a full congregation, have engaged in arc bending as well. It's good to remember our roots and to be reminded of our call of faith and conviction. So there's no need, I don't think, for me to return to the impact of the past few years on our country and ourselves. It feels like we really need to regain a center. We need to find our North Star again and begin again in love. It feels like after years of isolation and strained relations, so much stress on service providers and families and the old and the infirmed, that we need to find out how to be with one another again and how to tap into the sources that help us move beyond our own lives and into the common good. Our mission statement says we draw on shared values. They're right behind me here. The shared values are mindful interdependence, authentic curiosity, and curious love. Oh, thank you, courageous love. Was that, I don't, it's so funny with the mask, you can't tell who says something, it just sort of comes out from the crowd. As I said, they're woven into our banner every Sunday, and they sit here every Sunday, and I believe that when they're really woven into our hearts and our minds and our spirits, we're gonna find a way to greater engagement. I went to Beloit College, and during those years, I was a budding feminist, and I often went to the free lectures and things, because I loved that, because nobody was gonna grade me. I could just show up and listen. I remember being in a really crowded hall one night when Sonia Johnson, an author and rebel rouser, came to speak. I haven't actually revisited any of her writings lately, but an article I read this week cited her, and I thought they were helpful to me to kind of think about what's happening to me and what I feel like is happening around me at this point in the country, especially when it comes to the weight of all that's going on and this sense of powerlessness that many of us have succumbed to. She writes, "I remembered a story I heard once long ago about an experiment with frogs. Some of you may know where this is going. There was once an inhumane but well-intended biology teacher who brought two frogs and 2 tin cans into class one day. With all eyes upon him, he filled one can with water and he dropped the frog into it and he put the can on a hot plate. Little by little, the water heated up, and little by little, that little frog just adjusted to the increase in temperature. Adjusted, that is, until the water boiled. at which point it couldn't adjust any longer and it died before horrified eyes of a room full of teenagers. Then the teacher took the other can, and he also filled it with water, and as it began to boil, he tossed the frog into the can, and the frog, who was no fool, instantly leapt out of the can. So Sonia continues, little by little, imperceptibly, we adjust to increasingly deadly conditions and come to accept them as natural or inevitable. Little by little, we adjust to having freedoms stolen away from us, to having fewer and fewer choices, less and less voice in the decisions that affect our lives. Little by little, we come to believe we cannot do anything about this. Little by little, the water heats up. And because we are one of the most adaptable species on Earth, we keep adapting to new and ever more dangerous conditions and ideas. What should seem horrendous comes to seem normal. I've heard that story about frogs prior to reading this. It's an image and a metaphor that makes me mighty uncomfortable. And yet, those words, little by little, we come to believe we cannot do anything about this. Little by little, the water heats up, and because we are one of the most adaptable species on the earth, we keep adapting to new and ever more dangerous conditions and ideas. I don't know if you're feeling that yourself, people, but I am. What should seem horrendous comes to seem normal. It all speaks volumes to me. When I find that my center is not strong enough to propel me out of feeling overwhelmed, a general malaise, discouraged, or fearful, I turn to those who have found their way to the other side, who have jumped out of that can. I love those people who have found agency and love and action and hope. As you know, we're approaching MLK Day, which is on January 16th. His words and his actions and his legacy, they just continue to inspire me into a direction where I can lean into love and justice. He was the person who made Parker's words so well known and wove them into our psyches and as a mantra for continued engagement, even when the warmth of the pot is lulling us into complacency. This week I read a piece by MLK called A New Sense of Direction. I'm gonna link it into the Thursday update. It was so interesting, it's 12 pages long. It's a little bit of a commitment. But what I found so interesting, this was a speech he made in front of the staff of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference just a few months before he was assassinated. In there, he assesses the movement. And I just marveled at how his words and ideas have stood the test of time. Honestly, there were so many parts of that article that echo today, so I will share it with you, and I hope if you have time, you'll read it. He just had a keen sense of the energy of movements, the multiple fractions of society and how they are impacted, like what's happening in our legislature, what's happening in our country, what's happening in our communities. He spoke of the disillusionment of both the blacks and the whites during and following the civil rights movement, how people who felt we had gone far enough retreated. How those who were directly impacted knew we had barely gone far enough, and how those who were on the periphery, who watched or heard about groups who would be seen as radicals, judged their extreme actions with disdain. Think of our months around George Floyd and our commitment to trying to be an anti-racist church that works against white supremacy. He pointed out the danger of the status quo, the warm water, a place where so many Americans find acceptably comfortable. In his concluding remarks, he said, "We must accept finite disappointment, but must never lose infinite hope." I think that's a beautiful quote. We must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. That's that little arc that we can't see, but we can imagine. Finite disappointment isn't comfortable for those of us who want progress and who want it now, but we need the courage to leap. So during a small group this week, a couple of you who were in the small group are here, we're reading a book called Trusting Change, and we meet once a month to reflect on the words and the writing. I started with a reading by Richard Rohr. I don't know if many of you know him. He's a wise, progressive Catholic priest, prolific writer of books. He said, we are a culture of progress and efficiency, impatient with gradual growth. I don't know if that speaks to you. It certainly did to me. In our discussion with one another, we were reflecting on how we have these expectations of change or impact just ingrained in us. Whether it's doing a spiritual practice or whether it's searching for a map or answers when reading a book, we want results. We want progress. We are impatient. At least I can say for sure that I am. King and Parker knew that progress comes in fits and starts. They knew that backlash was inevitable, that resistance and the status quo and white supremacy and nationalism and greed and fear fight mightily to keep the ark from bending, to keep the water warm, and as many of us as possible floating in it. King told this story to the leaders he was addressing. He said, I flew from New York to London in a propeller-type aircraft that required 9.5 hours for a flight that we now would make in about 6 hours by jet. Returning from London to the United States, the stewardess announced that the flight time would be 12.5 hours, although the distance was the same. Why an additional 3 hours? When the pilot entered the cabin, I asked him why, and he said, something I will never forget. You must understand something about the winds. When we leave New York, a strong tailwind is in our favor, but when we return, a strong tailwind is against us. And then he added, don't worry, these 4 engines are capable of battling the winds. He went on to say to the leaders, in any social revolution, there are times when the tailwinds of triumph and fulfillment favor us, and other times when the strong headwinds of disappointment and setbacks beat against us relentlessly. We must not permit adverse winds to overwhelm as journey across life's Atlantic. We must be sustained by energies of courage and engines of courage in spite of the winds. This refusal to be stopped, this courage to be, this determination to go on in spite of, is the landmark of great movements. A sustaining movement within contemporary Unitarian Universalism is led, informed, and articulated by the UUA's Side with Love campaign. Here's an introduction to them on their webpage. Unitarian Universalists affirm unconditional, universal love as a foundation and grounding for our actions in the world. We strive to be of service to our communities and advocate for social change on a local, state, national, and international level. Through our Side with Love campaign, we amplify the voices of the oppressed through online media. We show up in partnership at justice events throughout the country. We lobby national leaders on immigration reform, racial justice, equality for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer people, religious freedom, and more. And above all, we do the work to make love real in the world. Cornel West, who spoke at our annual General Assembly in 2015, I had the joy of hearing him, probably Kathy as well, I know that. I don't know about others. He said, justice is what love looks like in public. And this is the kind of love that our Side with Love movement is centered on. This is the love that is woven through the Unitarian Universalist principles I spoke of earlier. It's the love that looks upon every person of inherent worth and dignity. It's a love that tells us to draw on our own compassion so we can engage in the work of justice and equity while centering those who are most impacted. It's a love that keeps us longing and being arc benders so that we can build a better world with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And it's a love that constantly reminds us we are not alone. We're part of a larger interdependent web of all existence. I really want to say I know the warm water is tempting, particularly on days when the weather is single digit, when our hearts are discouraged, when we see such little progress and even backlash. We shake our heads, we return to our couches, we turn on the radio or TV and just can't quite take it all in. We wonder if it's worth fighting for. Do what you can to shake yourself from that malaise. Find a way to generate some wind for the next stage of the journey. Find stories in your lives, in the lives of this congregation or a denomination, or in the lives of courageous neighbors or leaders who inspire you to write a check, to make a phone call to your legislator, to talk to a neighbor who might be engaging in a difficult conversation. Find a way to do what is ever needed to center your heart and spirit on the work of justice. Some of you may know that Martin Luther King announced the Poor People's Campaign at a staff retreat for the Southern Leadership Conference in 1967. This was the root of the famous March on Washington. The Poor People Campaign of today is led by Reverend William Barber. Both he and Reverend Martin Luther King spoke at past Unitarian Universalist assemblies. The current campaign for this Poor People's Campaign is super broad. It's focusing on politics and medical care and housing, military spending, taxation, all sorts of areas of injustice and inequalities of today. They say that so really actually I was gonna say like Barber and MLK were really on the front line of these movements. They, as you know, were arrested in order to put a wrench in the system, to show the system will go anywhere to hold the status quo and to silence those who want radical change. Reverend Maxwell Frost speaks of understanding the cost of not doing anything. He believes strongly in coalitions and in joining with others who are working for change. He knows that the place to find wind for the journey comes in the form of coalitions that share values, agendas, and strategies to expand their impact and effectiveness. In order to remember his North Star, his center, he says he will keep his mugshot visible in his office. There's so many ways. I'll talk a little bit more about him in a minute. Maybe I cut him out. Oh no, here we are. This is what he was quoted saying. He's so sweet, you guys. You really have to listen to him. Go home today and watch him. He says, but the one thing I won't lose sight of are the values and North Stars that I believe got me here. I plan on having my picture of my mugshot of when I was arrested for a nonviolent protest here in Central Florida during Black Lives Matter. He's gonna post it in his office. He said, it reminds me of where I came from and the work that I do. I don't think we all need to have mugshots on our walls. I don't think we all need to be in the front line, risking or purposely planning on being arrested as a strategy for post-social change. But I believe we'd be wise to put before us values and ideas and images that will remind us of our own center and North Stars. I believe we need to find ways, whatever ways you can, to be agents of social change and confront injustice. We need to be a part of the world we wish to see and that we want our children to inherit. I've heard several times this statement repeated. It's attributed to a UU minister, Harry Meserve. He said, if you were arrested for being a UU, would there be enough evidence to convict you? I find that a provocative question, uncomfortable, and a way to examine how I live my faith in the world. What is the evidence of how I live my faith in the world? Only I and only you can search our souls to know if we've been lulled into complacency or if we continue to be fueled by love that demands more of us. May we each continue to hear the call of a deep and wide and courageous love that persists in the work of justice through any and all ways we are capable of. And may this congregation continue to be a place where people find support for such work. May it be so, and amen. Some of you may know the history of the Side with Love office. When it first started, it was called Standing on the Side of Love, and as folks within the Unitarian Universalist Association were paying more attention to inclusion and to ableist language, they decided to just call it the Side with Love Side with Love office. And Janice got me this new stole to replace the old one, which I'm most grateful for. So we're going to sing hymn 1014. In your book, it says Standing on the Side of Love, but we're gonna sing Answering the Call of Love. So if you're distracted by the words in the book, just look on the screen. You can rise in body or spirit, and the choir will come up and sing. And if you're at home, please feel free to sing along with us. You will be muted.